In 1850, Cincinnati, Ohio, processed more pork than any city on earth. Its slaughterhouses killed and packed over 400,000 hogs a year. The blood ran in open channels through the streets, and the lard rendered from those carcasses made the candles and the soap that lit and cleaned half the country. That same year, the census confirmed what everyone already knew. Cincinnati was the sixth largest city in the United States, bigger than Chicago, bigger than St. Louis, bigger than San Francisco and Cleveland and Buffalo combined. It had 30 warehouses along the river and a commercial district that visitors compared favorably to Philadelphia. A London journalist passing through called it the most beautiful inland city in America. And on a June morning the following year, a group of men sitting in a convention hall, not in Cincinnati, but 60 miles northeast in Columbus, voted to approve a single clause in a new state constitution. It was Article 8. It said essentially that no city or county in Ohio could invest in or buy stock in any private corporation. The delegates thought they were protecting taxpayers from bad investments. What they actually did was cut the legs out from under the most powerful city between the Appalachians and the Rockies at the exact moment in history when legs were the only thing that mattered. To understand what Cincinnati lost, you have to understand what Cincinnati was. And what Cincinnati was, before anything else, was a river fortune. The city was founded in 1788 when a handful of settlers landed on the north bank of the Ohio River and called their village Losantiville, a name so awkward that the territorial governor, Arthur St. Clair, renamed it the following year for the Society of the Cincinnati, the Fraternal Order of Revolutionary War Officers. It was a decent spot. The river bent gently there, the landing was protected by hills, and Fort Washington went up almost immediately to keep the settlers from being killed. But it wasn't the best spot on the Ohio River. It wasn't the most scenic or the most protected. What it turned out to be was the most useful. The Ohio River was the great American highway before there were highways. It connected Pittsburgh to the east, the Mississippi to the south, and through a growing web of canals, the Great Lakes to the north. In 1811, the first steamboat appeared on the Ohio, captained improbably by an uncle of Theodore Roosevelt, and suddenly commerce could move upstream as well as down. By 1819, the river trade had transformed Cincinnati from a frontier garrison into a bustling commercial center, and it was officially chartered as a city. They called it Queen of the West, and there was no competition for the title. Anything that needed to get from one part of the country to another had a decent chance of passing through Cincinnati. The city had 30 warehouses along the waterfront, hotels and restaurants to serve the westbound migrants, and a growing commercial class that understood something fundamental. The value of Cincinnati was not what it produced, but where it sat. And what passed through Cincinnati increasingly was pork. The math was simple. Farmers across Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky raised hogs. Hogs could walk themselves to market. You didn't need wagons or barges. You just drove them down dirt roads toward the river in herds of hundreds, their hooves raising dust clouds that could be seen for miles. And once they arrived in Cincinnati, every part of the animal had a buyer. The packing houses developed what was essentially a disassembly line, decades before Henry Ford inverted the concept for automobiles. A hog entered at one end, and as it moved through the building on overhead hooks, different workers performed different cuts. It was industrial slaughter on a scale the world had never seen, and it was remarkably efficient. The meat was salted and packed in barrels. Cincinnati coopers made over 500,000 barrels a year just for pork. The lard was rendered into oil for lamps, tallow for candles, and fat for soap. The bristles went to brush makers. The bones became buttons. The bladders were sold as containers. A man named Richard Fosdick figured out a brine-curing process around 1810 and opened the first real packing house on Deer Creek. And within a generation, the city had dozens of slaughterhouses churning through hogs at industrial speed. By the 1840s, people were calling the place Porcopolis, and not always kindly. A newspaper in New Orleans reported in 1845, 160,000 hogs have already been slaughtered this year in Cincinnati. The smell was extraordinary. Pigs roamed freely through the lower streets. The creek that ran through the meatpacking district was, according to one account, so thick with offal that it barely moved. But the money moved. By 1850, Cincinnati was the principal hog market in the world, producing roughly a fifth of the nation's lard oil. And from pork came everything else. The barrels needed for shipping created a thriving cooperage industry. The steamboats that carried the barrels needed repair, so Cincinnati became a shipbuilding center. The workers who built the ships and packed the hogs needed housing, tools, clothing, furniture. So the city built those industries too: ironworks, machine shops, carriage factories, textile mills. By mid-century, Cincinnati had the most diversified manufacturing economy in the American interior. It made steamboat boilers and printing presses and playing cards and pianos. It was not a one-industry town. It was a one-industry origin story, everything traced back to the pig. And from the pig specifically came one of the most consequential business partnerships in American history. In 1837, an English candle maker named William Procter and an Irish soap maker named James Gamble, brothers-in-law who had married sisters, were persuaded by their father-in-law, Alexander Norris, to stop competing with each other and join forces. Both men needed the same raw material, animal fat, and animal fat was the one thing Cincinnati had in irrational abundance. They each put up $3,596.47 and opened a shop at Main and 6th Streets. Procter ran the sales. Gamble ran the kettle. Each morning, Gamble went door to door at houses, hotels, and steamboats, collecting ash and meat scraps, bartering soap cakes for raw materials. It was not glamorous work, but by 1859, annual sales hit $1 million, and they had 80 employees. When the Civil War came, P&G won contracts to supply the Union Army with soap and candles, and every soldier who used their product carried the memory home. It was the company's first national exposure, paid for by federal appropriation. The company they created would eventually become the largest consumer goods corporation on the planet, and it would never leave Cincinnati. But in 1837, it was just two men making candles and soap from pig lard in a city that smelled like a slaughterhouse. The city's growth in the 1840s was almost violent in its speed. The population had been about 25,000 in 1830. It was 46,000 by 1840. By 1850, it was 115,000, a nearly five-fold increase in 20 years. And a huge portion of those new arrivals were German. By the 1850s, roughly 40% of Cincinnati's population was of German origin, and they remade the city in their image. They settled north of the Miami and Erie Canal, the waterway that connected Cincinnati to Dayton and the interior, in an area that the established residents, with some condescension, began calling Over-the-Rhine, because crossing the canal was like crossing the Rhine into a foreign country. The name stuck. It is still the name. What the Germans brought, besides labor and skill and that distinctive architecture of tall, narrow brick buildings packed tight against each other, was beer. The first German-owned brewery opened in 1829. By 1860, there were 36 breweries in a city of 161,000 people. These were not small operations. They were enormous, architecturally spectacular enterprises with underground lagering tunnels bored into the hillsides, because lager, the style the Germans favored, needed cold storage, and before mechanical refrigeration, the only way to get it was to go underground. The tunnels are still there, beneath the streets of Over-the-Rhine. 4 stories below Vine Street, in vaulted brick chambers that haven't held a barrel in a century, you can still feel the chill. By 1893, Cincinnati's per capita beer consumption was 40 gallons per person. Men, women, and children averaged together, roughly 2.5 times the national average. The Christian Meerline Brewing Company was exporting beer to South America and Europe. The city was producing 1.5 million barrels a year, and the saloons and beer gardens of Over-the-Rhine drew crowds of 8,000 and 10,000 on warm evenings. When the financial panic of 1857 hit and the banks started failing, the Germans of Cincinnati trusted their savings not to the banks but to the brewers. The brewers, after all, had kegs. The banks just had paper. This is the city at its zenith, and the zenith has a precise date. It is 1850. The population is 115,435. The ranking is 6th. The river is full of steamboats, the packing houses are running at capacity, the Germans are building their breweries, Procter Gamble has just crossed $1 million in annual sales, with lard oil as their top product, ahead of candles and soap. And from the hills above the basin, you can look down on a city that seems to have solved the problem of the American interior. It is dense, prosperous, culturally ambitious, architecturally serious, and growing at a rate that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. Visitors from the East Coast admitted that Cincinnati was perhaps the most important city in the West. And in Columbus, on June 17, 1851, the voters of Ohio ratified a new state constitution. Here is the context. In the 1830s and 1840s, Ohio's state and local governments had invested heavily in canal companies and early railroad ventures. Some of these investments paid off, many did not. The Indiana-style financial collapse, where a state or city guaranteed bonds for a private company that then went bankrupt, leaving the government holding the debt, was a real and recent memory. Several Ohio cities had been burned badly. The delegates to the 1851 Constitutional Convention were, understandably, in a mood to prevent it from happening again. So they wrote Article 8, which included a provision that no county, city, or town in Ohio could become a stockholder in or loan its credit to any joint stock company or corporation. The intent was fiscal prudence. The effect was something else entirely. The timing could not have been worse. In 1851, the railroad revolution was just beginning. The great question of the next 2 decades, the question that would determine which American cities thrived and which ones didn't, was who gets the rail connections. And the way most cities answered that question was by investing in railroad companies. They bought stock. They guaranteed bonds. They offered land and subsidies. They competed ferociously for every line because every line meant freight traffic, passenger traffic, jobs, and growth. Cities that couldn't invest couldn't compete. Illinois had no such constitutional restriction, and Illinois had Chicago. In 1850, Chicago was a city of about 30,000 people, less than a third of Cincinnati's size. It was a trading post built on a swamp, incorporated only 14 years earlier, with nothing like Cincinnati's cultural depth or industrial base. But it had one thing Cincinnati now lacked: the legal freedom to throw public money at railroads, and that is exactly what it did. Chicago's boosters, politicians, and businessmen invested aggressively in rail connections north, west, south, and east. They bought stock, guaranteed bonds, offered land grants. They didn't just wait for railroads to come to them. They bought their way into the network. The Illinois Central, chartered in 1851, the same year Ohio was locking its cities out of the railroad business, received enormous public subsidies and made Chicago the anchor of a rail empire that stretched from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Within a decade, Chicago was the most important railroad junction in North America. It hadn't earned the position through geography. It had purchased it through investment, the exact kind of investment Ohio's Constitution had just forbidden. Cincinnati, meanwhile, was stuck. Its businessmen could invest privately, and they did. But the city itself, the entity with the deepest pockets and the greatest incentive, was constitutionally forbidden from participating. Ohio's cities could not buy railroad stock. They could not guarantee railroad bonds. They could not do what Chicago, St. Louis, and dozens of other cities in other states were doing to attract rail. And the railroads, following the money, went elsewhere. The consequences arrived slowly at first, and then all at once. In the 1850s, the railroads were still supplementing river trade, not replacing it, and Cincinnati's position on the Ohio was still worth something. The city had 14 competing soap and candle manufacturers, dozens of machine shops, a booming furniture industry. Mitchell and Ramelsburg alone employed hundreds of craftsmen making chairs and desks that shipped across the country. But the furniture shipped by river, the soap shipped by river, and the railroads were going to Chicago. Then the Civil War accelerated everything. The Union Army needed provisions, and it needed them delivered by rail, and it needed them from the north and the west, from places like Chicago, which could pull grain and meat from the Great Plains and the upper Midwest, not from Cincinnati, which depended on river trade with the South. When the war started in 1861, Cincinnati's southern markets vanished overnight. One historian wrote that the city was completely stagnated commercially and industrially by the first year of the conflict. The irony was savage. Cincinnati sat on the border between free Ohio and slave Kentucky, and the very river that had made its fortune was now a line of military demarcation. Louisville, just 100 miles downriver, had rail connections to Nashville and beyond. Cincinnati had the river, and the river now had a war running through it. By 1870, Chicago's population was 300,000. Cincinnati's was 216,000. Chicago was growing at 5 times Cincinnati's rate. And the gap was not about geography or resources or ingenuity. Cincinnati had all three. The gap was about one clause in one constitution, ratified by voters who had no idea what they were doing to the greatest city in their state. It took a man named Edward A. Ferguson to find the loophole. Ferguson was an Ohio state senator from Cincinnati, and he understood the problem with perfect clarity. The city needed a railroad south to Chattanooga, where it could connect to the network serving Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the rest of the former Confederacy. Louisville had such a connection via the Louisville and Nashville Railway, and it was eating Cincinnati's lunch. Kentucky wasn't going to help. Most of its rail led to Louisville, a direct competitor. No private company had managed to build the line. And the Ohio Constitution said Cincinnati couldn't invest in one. But Ferguson noticed something. The Constitution said cities couldn't buy stock in a corporation. It didn't say cities couldn't build and own a railroad themselves. It was a legal distinction so fine it was almost invisible, but it was real. In 1869, Ferguson got the Ohio legislature to pass a bill, the Ferguson Act, authorizing any Ohio city with a population over 150,000 to construct and own its own railroad. There was exactly one city in Ohio with a population over 150,000. On June 26, 1869, Cincinnati's voters went to the polls and approved $10 million in municipal bonds to build the Cincinnati Southern Railway, a 337-mile line from Cincinnati to Chattanooga. More than 15,000 people voted yes. 1,500 voted no. The margin was overwhelming, and the celebration was extraordinary. Parades through the streets, church bells ringing across the basin. A city that had watched Chicago and Louisville and St. Louis pull ahead for 18 years, finally doing something about it. It was, in its way, magnificent. It was also 18 years too late. The Cincinnati Southern Railway was a staggering feat of engineering. The route cut through some of the most brutal terrain in eastern Kentucky and Tennessee, requiring the construction of 27 tunnels and 105 bridges. A section in Kentucky became known as the Rat Hole for the sheer difficulty of the work. The crews were mostly Irish and black laborers, blasting through mountain rock with dynamite. The initial $10 million ran out by 1875. Voters approved another $6 million in 1876 and another $2 million in 1878. The first freight train completed the journey to Chattanooga on February 21, 1880. The first passenger train followed on March 8th. A grand banquet was held at Music Hall, Cincinnati's soaring new concert venue, with Southern dignitaries in attendance. The city had its railroad, but the world had moved on. Chicago was now the undisputed capital of the American interior, the hub through which all railroads spoke. Cincinnati's line to Chattanooga was important, and it would generate revenue for a century and a half, but it was one line. Chicago had dozens. The race had been lost in 1851, and no amount of dynamite in the Kentucky hills was going to change that. What Cincinnati did next was something more poignant and more complicated than simply declining. It built itself into a city of astonishing beauty and cultural ambition, a city that, in many ways, was more architecturally interesting and culturally rich than Chicago, while simultaneously falling further and further behind in the only metric the industrial age cared about: growth. John A. Roebling, the German-born engineer, had been working on a suspension bridge across the Ohio River since before the Civil War. When it finally opened on January 1, 1867, it was the longest suspension bridge in the world, spanning 1,057 feet between Cincinnati and Covington, Kentucky. Before the bridge, you crossed the river by ferry. After the bridge, you walked across a structure so elegant and so obviously ahead of its time that when Roebling was hired to build a bridge in Brooklyn, he essentially scaled up the Cincinnati design. The Brooklyn Bridge is the most famous bridge in the world, and it is Cincinnati's bridge, refined. In 1871, a businessman named Henry Probasco, honoring his late partner Tyler Davidson, commissioned a 43-foot bronze fountain from a German sculptor and installed it at 5th and Vine Streets. The Tyler Davidson Fountain, the genius of water, became Cincinnati's symbol, the thing every visitor photographed, the place where people gathered in the evenings. The inscription read, To the people of Cincinnati. In 1876, Reuben Springer, a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune in the river trade, was sitting in the Sangerfest Halle during the second annual May Festival, Cincinnati's celebrated choral event, when a thunderstorm hit and the rain on the tin roof was so loud it drowned out the orchestra. Springer was mortified. He issued a public challenge. If the citizens of Cincinnati would raise half the cost of a proper concert hall, he would pay the other half. It is believed to have been the first matching grant fund drive in American history. The money was raised. Samuel Hannaford, the most prolific architect in the city, designed the building in high Victorian Gothic with a rose window on the facade and an auditorium that seated 5,228, the largest in the country until Chicago's auditorium building surpassed it in 1889. Even in cultural achievement, Chicago was coming up behind. Music Hall opened in May 1878 and cost $500,000, more than half of it Springer's money. Today it still stands on Elm Street and Over-the-Rhine, still hosts the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, the Cincinnati Opera, the Cincinnati Ballet, and the May Festival. It is the only 19th century concert hall in the United States, with a major orchestra still in residence. The city's hills, the steep, dramatic hills that ring the basin on three sides, gave Cincinnati something no other American city had: inclines. Starting in 1872, the city built 5 inclined railways to carry people, streetcars, and wagons up the slopes to the hilltop neighborhoods. The Mount Auburn incline came first, with a lookout house at the top that drew 10,000 visitors on weekends. The Mount Adams incline followed in 1876 with Highland House, where the symphony orchestra played outdoor concerts for crowds of 8,000. These were not just transportation, they were spectacle. You rode a platform up the side of a hill and stepped out into a resort that looked down on the city basin and the river and the Kentucky hills beyond. No city in America had anything like it. Pittsburgh had similar terrain and built its own inclines, but Cincinnati's were bigger, more elaborate, and better integrated into the city's social life. Samuel Hannaford didn't stop with Music Hall. He designed Cincinnati's City Hall in Richardsonian Romanesque, completed in 1893 at a cost of $1.61 million, with marble from Italy and Tennessee, granite columns from Vermont, and stained glass windows depicting Cincinnatus, the Roman farmer general for whom the city was named. He designed the observatory, the Elsinore Arch, churches and hotels and houses across the basin and the hills. His firm worked in Cincinnati for over 60 years. He was not building for a city in decline. He was building for a city that believed it was still ascending. And in a way it was. The population kept growing, from 255,000 in 1880 to 326,000 in 1900 to 401,000 in 1920. But the ranking kept falling, 8th in 1880, 10th in 1900, 16th in 1920. The city was getting bigger. Everyone else was getting bigger faster. Cincinnati built beautiful things. Chicago built an empire. Procter Gamble, meanwhile, was becoming enormous. James Norris Gamble, the founder's son, invented the formula for ivory soap in 1879, a soap so light it floated on water, which turned out to be a brilliant marketing advantage. The company moved to a new factory complex on the Mill Creek called Ivorydale and began advertising nationally with a sophistication that was decades ahead of its competitors. By the early 20th century, P&G had introduced Crisco, the first all-vegetable shortening, pioneered the concept of brand management, and become one of the largest companies in America. It stayed in Cincinnati. It has always stayed in Cincinnati. The breweries were not so lucky. When Prohibition hit in 1920, it devastated Over-the-Rhine. The neighborhood had been built on beer, its economy, its social life, its identity. 36 breweries had operated here at the peak. Now they were all closed or converted. Some tried to pivot to near beer or soft drinks. Most simply died. Even after repeal in 1933, the national brands, Anheuser-Busch, Miller, Schlitz, had the capital and the distribution networks to dominate the market, and Cincinnati's local brewers never recovered their former prominence. The last locally owned brewery closed in 1978. Over-the-Rhine, without its economic engine, began its long, slow collapse into poverty. The ornate Italianate buildings that the German brewers had financed stood empty, their windows dark, their purpose gone. In 1916, the city tried to build a subway. The plan was to drain the old Miami and Erie Canal, which had been obsolete for decades, a stagnant open sewer running through the city, and build a rapid transit loop in the canal bed, partly underground and partly at grade. The voters approved it overwhelmingly, almost 6-1, authorizing $6 million in bonds. The fare was set at 5 cents. But the United States entered World War I before construction could begin, and by the time the first steam shovel bit into the canal at Walnut Street on January 28, 1920, wartime inflation had made the $6 million budget a fantasy. The engineers pressed on anyway. They completed about 2 miles of tunnel and 4 stations, Race Street, Brighton, Liberty, and Hopple, before the money ran out in 1925. The total cost had reached the original budget, and the system was maybe a third finished. The tunnels are still there. They are sealed with concrete and blocked by brick walls. They have never carried a single passenger. In 1928, construction was canceled indefinitely. In 2002, the Southwest Ohio Regional Transit Authority put a light rail plan called Metro Moves on the ballot, which would have incorporated the old subway stations and built an extensive transit network across the region. Hamilton County voters rejected it 2-1. In 2008, the city studied its options. Finish the subway for $100.5 million, fill the tunnels with dirt for $19 million, or just preserve them as is for $2.6 million. They chose the cheapest option. The tunnels now carry a water main and fiber optic cables. 2 miles of silence beneath Central Parkway, which was the road they built on top of the drained canal, on top of the unfinished subway. And then there was Union Terminal. By the 1920s, Cincinnati was served by 7 railroads operating out of 5 different stations scattered across the basin, all of them cramped, inconvenient, and prone to flooding every time the Ohio River rose. Only 20% of the trains entering the city were through trains, meaning that 80% of travelers had to get off at one station, haul their luggage across town, and board at another. The idea of consolidating everything into one grand terminal had been discussed since 1884, but it wasn't until 1928 that construction actually began. The architects Fellheimer and Wagner designed the structure, and in 1930, at the urging of the development company, they brought in Paul-Philippe Crête to reimagine the exterior. What Crête created was a masterpiece of Art Deco architecture, a vast half-dome of concrete and glass, 200 feet wide, fronted by a fountain and a sweeping drive, with mosaic murals inside by Winold Rice, depicting the industries and peoples of Cincinnati. It was the most beautiful train station in America. It cost $41 million. It opened on March 31st, 1933. The timing was, once again, catastrophic. The Depression was 3 years old. Passenger rail was entering its long decline. The station that was built to handle 216 trains a day was handling a fraction of that within a decade. By the 1960s, it was nearly empty. In 1972, Amtrak discontinued passenger service to Cincinnati, and Union Terminal fell silent. The concourse, the great interior space with the mosaics, was demolished. For 5 years in the 1980s, the building was a shopping mall. Today it houses the Cincinnati Museum Center, which saved the structure from the wrecking ball. But the irony is embedded in the walls. Cincinnati built the finest train station in the country just as trains stopped mattering, the same way it built its own railroad just as the race for railroads had already been lost. The ground-level destruction came in the 1950s and 1960s. Cincinnati's 1948 master plan called for slum clearance in the West End, a dense, historically black neighborhood west of downtown. What followed was urban renewal on a scale that was staggering even by the grim standards of the era. The city received federal funds to build Interstate 75 through the heart of the West End and to create an industrial park called Queensgate, where the neighborhood had been. By the early 1960s, more than 2,800 buildings had been demolished. Nearly 3,700 structures on 450 acres were razed. 25,000 people, 97% of them black, were displaced. The NAACP warned as early as 1958 that the city wasn't serious about rehousing the displaced residents, and they were right. The West End's population dropped from 67,520 in 1950 to 17,068 in 1970. An area the size of Over-the-Rhine was simply erased. Where Holy Trinity Catholic Church once stood, with its choir that Laverne Summerlin still remembers, there is now the 5th Street exit ramp of Their 75 South. The inclines died in this period, too. The Mount Adams Incline, the last one running, closed in April 1948. In its final year of operation, it earned $8,407 in fares and cost $68,617 to operate. There were proposals to save it, have the city take it over, run it as a tourist attraction, convert the car house into a restaurant. None of them went anywhere. The automobile had won, and the inclines were dismantled, and the view from the hilltops was now something you drove to, not something you rose toward on a platform named after a 19th century financier. The population peaked at 503,998 in 1950, then began its long slide. 452,000 in 1970, 364,000 in 1990, 309,000 in 2010. The metropolitan area continued to grow, reaching 2.2 million, but the city itself, the basin, the hills, the neighborhoods that Hannaford and the Germans had built, hollowed out. Over-the-Rhine, which had been a thriving working-class German neighborhood in the 19th century, became one of the most impoverished and dangerous neighborhoods in the country by the 1990s. The brewery building stood empty. The lagering tunnels collected dust. The ornate Italianate facades, those tall, narrow brick buildings with their arched windows and iron cornices, deteriorated behind plywood and chain-link fencing. It was one of the largest collections of 19th century urban architecture in the United States, and it was rotting. And through all of this, Cincinnati still owned a railroad. The Cincinnati Southern Railway, that monument to Edward Ferguson's ingenuity and the city's determination to fight back against the 1851 Constitution, had been leased to a private operator since 1881. First the Cincinnati, New Orleans, and Texas Pacific Railway, then the Southern Railway, and eventually Norfolk Southern. The city collected lease payments and kept ownership. It was the only municipality in the United States to own an interstate railroad. For a century and a half, Cincinnati held on to the one thing it had built to save itself. In November 2023, the city voted on whether to sell. Norfolk Southern offered $1.6 billion. The proceeds would go into a trust fund, the interest used to repair Cincinnati's crumbling infrastructure. The bridges, the roads, the parks, the municipal buildings that decades of deferred maintenance had left in disrepair. The city was receiving about $25 million a year in lease payments. The trust fund, proponents argued, could generate $50 million to $70 million a year in perpetuity. Opponents said the city was giving away a unique, irreplaceable asset for a fraction of its long-term value. The campaign in favor of the sale was well funded, backed in part by Norfolk Southern itself. The vote was close. Of the 83,732 ballots cast, 43,173 voted to sell, and 40,559 voted to keep the railroad. The margin was 2,614 votes, about 3%. And just like that, the Cincinnati Southern Railway, the railroad that a city built because a constitution wouldn't let it invest in someone else's, the railroad that took 11 years and $18 million and 27 tunnels through Kentucky rock, the railroad whose completion was celebrated with a banquet at Music Hall and church bells ringing across the basin, that railroad passed out of Cincinnati's hands. There is a viewing platform atop the Carew Tower, the Art Deco skyscraper that went up at 441 Vine Street in 1930, just as the stock market was collapsing. It was named for Joseph T. Carew, who founded the Mabley and Carew department store chain, and it was designed as a city within a city, stores, offices, restaurants, and a grand hotel, all under one roof. One of the earliest mixed-use developments in America, conceived simultaneously with Rockefeller Center in New York. Ground was broken in September 1929, 1 month before the crash, and the construction was scaled back. Only the first 3 floors got the expensive marble and mosaic finishes. The rest is plain brick. The hotel was supposed to be called the St. Nicholas Plaza, but the owners of the old Hotel Sinton claimed they held the rights to that name from a previous establishment on 4th Street, and so it became the Netherland Plaza instead. It cost $33 million and was, for decades, the tallest building in Cincinnati at 574 feet. From the observation deck on the 49th floor, you pay $4, ride one express elevator and one older, smaller one. You can see everything. The Roebling Bridge, still standing, its cables still taut across the Ohio. Union Terminal's half dome, 3 miles to the west, where the museum center keeps the mosaics that were almost destroyed. The river, curving south toward Kentucky, the same river that brought the flatboats and the steamboats and the hogs and the Germans and William Procter and James Gamble and all the rest of it. Over-the-Rhine is down there, too, partly renovated now. The Rheingeist Brewery opened in 2013 in the old Christian Merline Packing Hall on Elm Street, and the restaurants and bars along Vine Street are full on weekends. The lagering tunnels have been turned into cocktail lounges. You can sit 4 stories underground, beneath crystal chandeliers, sipping a drink in a vaulted brick room that once held 10,000 barrels of lager, and it is genuinely beautiful, and it is also a very particular kind of American beauty. The beauty of a thing repurposed because its original purpose was taken away. The Procter Gamble headquarters is still downtown, a pair of octagonal towers overlooking the river. The company that started with pig fat and a handwritten amendment to its stationery, and Gamble, was literally penned in at the top of Procter's existing letterhead to save the cost of new paper, now makes Tide and Pampers and Gillette and Crest and Charmin and earns more in a quarter than the entire city of Cincinnati collects in a decade. The irony is that Cincinnati's single greatest corporate asset was born from pig lard, and the pig lard came from the river trade, and the river trade was the thing the railroad was supposed to replace. Fountain Square is still there, the Tyler Davidson fountain still running in warm weather, still inscribed to the people of Cincinnati. The Red Stockings, the first professional baseball team in American history, they won 57 games and tied one in their inaugural 1869 season, a record that still stands as the best debut in professional sports, are still playing, though they're just the Reds now, at Great American Ballpark along the river. But the subway tunnels are still empty. The West End is still mostly highway and industrial park. The inclines are gone, all 5 of them, and the railroad that was going to save everything. The railroad a city built because it was the only city in America whose state wouldn't let it do what every other city was doing. The railroad belongs to Norfolk Southern now. The check cleared in early 2024. From the top of Carew Tower, if you look northeast on a clear day, you can see, across more than 300 miles of Ohio farmland and Indiana prairie, the faintest atmospheric suggestion of something large on the horizon. You cannot actually see Chicago from Cincinnati, but you can feel it, the gravitational pull of the city that won, the city that had no Article 8, the city that was free to buy its way into the railroad age while Cincinnati stood on the banks of the Ohio River with $10 million in bonds and a constitution that said no. The 1851 convention delegates are long dead. They were trying to be careful with public money. They succeeded. Cincinnati never made a bad investment in a railroad corporation. Cincinnati never invested in a railroad corporation at all. The river is the same width it always was. The current moves at roughly the same speed. The steamboats are gone, but the barges still come through, low and slow, carrying coal and aggregate. There is an old ferry, the Anderson Ferry, that has been running 8 miles west of downtown since 1817. It still crosses the Ohio back and forth all day long. It is the oldest continuously operating business in Cincinnati. When it started, Cincinnati was a frontier village of a few thousand people. When it celebrated its 200th year of operation, Cincinnati was a city of 300,000, which was only 60% of what it had been at its peak, which was never what it should have been, which was the fault of a constitution, which was the fault of a vote, which was the fault of good intentions. Which is, if you think about it, the most American kind of fault there is. The ferry takes about 4 minutes to cross. The fare is a few dollars. If you stand at the rail and look east, downriver, toward the basin where the city began, you can see the Roebling Bridge in the distance, and beyond it the skyline, and the Carew Tower above everything, its plain brick upper floors catching the late afternoon light. It is a beautiful view. It has always been a beautiful view. That was never the problem.